All right, I'm going to get started here. Welcome everybody, and from across the country and across Canada as well. So, big welcome to the third annual Northeast Midwest Prescribed Fire Science and Management Workshop. This year, we're taking a fresh approach, a different approach. Sometimes, being forced into this by changing times and doing a blended learning excursion, we're calling it. And we think that we're in for some success with this format. The event again spans 3 days, combining virtual learning with in-person field trip opportunities in between. And so we're excited to bring you this format. We actually have 21 of those field trips planned across the region. So I'm Dave Salino. I'm the Chief Fire Warden for the state of Massachusetts and also the chair of the Northeast Midwest Regional Strategy Committee of Cohesive Strategy as well. And so I wanted to talk just quickly about the registration because this is phenomenal. As of this morning, we have 346 folks registered for this third workshop. And we've got some great numbers out there. I just wanted to run down and show with folks who's represented. That's sort of one of the challenges of doing this virtually. You don't get to meet out at the coffee table and in the hallway and learn, where everyone is from. But we've got a strong showing from a number of the Northeast states with heavy hitters, Illinois, 68 folks, Minnesota, 57, New York, there's 22 folks in here from New York, and then a smattering of all of the New England states in the Northeast region. What's great to see, folks, is that we have states and provinces represented from outside the Northeast, including British Columbia, California, Colorado, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, coming in with 10 joining us here for this workshop, North Dakota, New Mexico, and in Ontario, Canada. So welcome to those folks. Oh, I left out Wisconsin as a heavy hitter with 29 folks registered too. But welcome to our friends from outside of the Northeast region. We really value your participation. So I'm going to just kind of kick this off with a little bit of leaders' intent. And again, this goes back, this is our third annual workshop, but boy, the planning goes back and the vision goes back 4 to 5 years in the making. And so we've had this vision for a number of years, and one of those is to provide a forum for all wildland fire management partners to share region-wide, science-based fire ecology information oriented towards expanding and maintaining the use of prescribed fire across all of these landscapes, all agencies, all lands, in fire-dependent ecosystems. Provide an opportunity for scientists and managers and practitioners across the 20-state region to share prescribed fire-related experiences, successes, and potential solutions to challenges that we face out there. That was one of the main reasons that we developed this, was to really bring researchers, scientists, and practitioners and managers together into one room. We'd like to provide an opportunity for agency leaders and managers to interact with state prescribed fire councils and other key partners, as well as those practitioners on the ground. We have some objectives for you, and that is we'd like to inspire practitioners, the decision makers, and outreach leaders to follow examples and explore not whether, but how to restore beneficial fire back to our landscapes. Empower participants with an understanding of the scale of risks and planning associated with prescribed fire, and promote acceptance and desire to burn in places that we know need it. This is a special workshop for us. It is dedicated in the memory of Craig Meyer, who passed away, unfortunately, in November of 2024. At the end of the workshop, we'll be announcing a tribute to Craig in honor of him, and that is going to be the Craig Meyer Prescribed Fire Awards, named in honor of Craig. He was coordinator of the Tall Grass Prairie and Oak Savanna Fire Science Consortium, and he was a grassland ecologist. Craig has always been a staunch proponent of prescribed fire science and implementation. And I can tell you that Craig is one of the founding folks and coordinators of this particular workshop, and the very idea of bringing this to you, our practitioners across the country, right? So let's just quickly take a look at what we have planned for the next 3 days. And so day one is going to feature half a day of virtual presentations. We are super honored to have our keynote speaker, Dr. Stephen Pyne, in a session on the many cultures of fire. I'm excited to hear this and see this again. What a great opportunity for us to have Dr. Pyne on here. In addition, we'll have many cultures of fire presentations from Bazile Panek, the founder Chief Executive Officer of Good Sky Guidance, and Mary Huffman from the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network, TNC. Day two is the interesting one, and there's some folks on here that did a great job to bring this all together. How do you have a virtual workshop, but yet deliver 21 in-person field trips? It's going to happen tomorrow on day two, hosted independently across the Northeast Midwest by the participants on this workshop, and plus some educational virtual sessions on Wednesday for those who can't attend in the field trip. On day three, we'll have another half day of virtual presentations, starting with John McCabe from the Forest Reserves of Cook County, Illinois. That's a great story of success on the fascinating work in and around the Chicago wilderness area, and a set of state Ignite presentations focused on common denominators of organizational, local, and regional fire cultures for success. Wildland fire management by representation from each of the 20 states in prescribed fire. That's what we want to see out of this, folks. That's one of those objectives, is exposing some of these little success stories. I never knew anything about the forest reserves of Cook County, Illinois, until we were in Madison, Wisconsin for the first one, and what a great story. So what we want to do is we have some thank yous here, well deserved, and so first one goes to our sponsors. The workshop is sponsored by the Northeast Regional Strategy Committee of the Cohesive Strategy. This is one of the things that we do for the last 13 years, really, when the regional strategy committees were established, the West, the South, and the East, the Northeast, and that is to facilitate opportunities like this. And today's presenters are brought to you by the Tall Grass Prairie and Oak Savannah Fire Science Consortium. All right, and so we have a few other sponsors. I'm going to click them onto the screen. And many thanks to the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange, the Forest Stewards Guild, really getting involved and becoming a force of support here for these efforts. The Lake States Fire Science Consortium has been a huge leader for us in this effort. The Pennsylvania Prescribed Fire Council, one of the great models for prescribed fire councils nationally. The Wisconsin Prescribed Fire Council as well, the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council, and then we have a contractor on here, and that's Star Tree Wildfire Protection. Although a contractor led by none other than Bill Edwards, the former state fire supervisor for New Jersey. So we're grateful to have their support. And then the Ohio Prescribed Fire Council as well. There's some huge thank yous that we really owe here. And so first of all, the featured speakers, we certainly appreciate your time. We know that a lot of us have tight schedules out there and a lot of commitments, and especially right here in the middle of summer. We're jumping into fire season. We know we have resources moving already across the country, and so many thanks to the speakers this week for working with us and taking the time to share all of the valuable information that you have. The planning team, which you can see in your program, but really a huge kudos led by Jack McGowan-Stinsky. He's the manager of the Lake States Fire Science Consortium and been one of the masterminds at really kind of developing this the last 2 years. Um, I have to highlight the powerhouse behind making this happen, and that is our event planner, Michael Robinson, and the team from Full Scope. And so we've worked with Michael at the national level, the National Cohesive Strategy workshops. We brought her to the Northeast here to help guide this process, and right up and through this morning, and our meetings yesterday. It's just constantly thank God for Michael Robinson to be herding the cats for us here and really bringing this to fruition. And then recognition of the sponsors that we just showed you. And then the last one is thanks to all of the participants, to have 346 of you take time out of your busy schedules to participate in this and bring something to the table as well. We really are grateful for your participation. There is some guidelines that we have to put in place, especially when we're in this kind of a format, and so and we have this many registrants involved. And these guidelines are to provide, consistent, transparent, respectful across all, participants and sessions, and that's super important. The workshop panelists and the moderators have invested their time in preparing for each discussion, and so we ask that all the participants likewise take the time to prepare questions for the panelists and moderators, and be respectful and succinct. And so here's a few guidelines for you that we ask that you follow. And we first want you to ask yourself the question: does your proposed question meet one of the following criteria? My question is seeking clarification or further discussion of one of the panelists' points. My question is relevant to the broader audience. My question is thought-provoking or connects to key prescribed fire issues. What we really want to do is get those questions out there that are going to help all of the audience maybe gain answers to challenges that they're facing. And so we can't get to that objective if we go too far off the rails at the issues that we're talking about. We ask that if your question is more of a comment, can you reframe it as a question? And then if your question is specific to a site you manage, can you reframe it as a broader question, right? So do you think that it pertains to a region-wide challenge or an issue or even nationally? And maybe kind of frame up your question that way. If your question requires a long backstory, how can you translate your concern into a succinct question? And that's important. That's really kind of getting right to the issue that you want to get answered. And then finally, for those of you on here, we want to say many thanks to a key person here, and that's Larry Mastic. He's been the coordinator for the Northeast Regional Strategy Committee for 13 years, since its inception. And so for those, I wanted to share this with folks at the beginning, and you'll hear more information at the end in the wrap up on Thursday. But I wanted to share it at the beginning because I know Larry has a lot of friends on here. And so Larry is, after all these years, Larry has decided he's threatened to actually fully retire here. We'll see if that really comes to fruition. I think we'll see him again in different venues, but 13 years as the Northeast RSC coordinator. He's retired U.S. Forest Service with 35 years of service there. He was the deputy area director at the Forest Service Northeast area from 2006 to 2010. He was a silviculturalist at the Lincoln National Forest from 1989 to 1995. There's some great pictures, and I got to say that It has been an honor to work with Larry as the coordinator. The coordinators have always been the horsepower behind these regional strategy committees, making them work on a day-to-day basis. And Larry excels at that. He has a huge passion. And so if you look, by example, that third picture down, there's Larry holding court. He and I were in an airport together, and Larry's holding court there and explaining why we need alternative pathways to prescribed fire qualifications, for instance. And he had a big crowd around him. So with that said, I'm going to jump back a slide. I'm gonna transition over to Neil Gifford, and we're gonna have this slide up. Neil's going to be your moderator, and once again, on behalf of the RSC in the Northeast, a huge thank you for participating, and we will see you towards the end of the week. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Good morning, everyone. My name is Neil Gifford, Conservation Director for the Albany Pine Bush Preserve Commission in Albany, New York, within the unceded territory of the Stockbridge-Munsee community of Mohican Indians. The Commission is a New York State Public Benefit Corporation within the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, which manages a preserve of more than 3,400 acres. Since 1991, we've been using wildland fire science and management to restore one of the world's best remaining examples of an inland pine barrens while reducing wildfire risk. I'm honored to serve as your host and moderator today, and I will be back again on Thursday for the same role. But I begin today with gratitude for our presenters and all of you joining us for this workshop, a blended learning excursion. Fire is not only essential to all of our work, but also, much like water, fundamental to human cultures around the world. Our speakers today will highlight these cultural connections with fire. I ask that everyone use the Q&A feature of the Zoom webinar. Please feel free to populate that as the day moves along. We will visit the Q&A during this afternoon's panel discussion. Importantly, please remember the Q&A guidelines that are on the screen currently and that Dave just went over. With that, I'm going to ask Dave to stop sharing his screen. And if Steve, if you could share your screen, that would be fantastic. So it is an honor to introduce our first speaker, a person who likely needs little introduction for this audience. Steve Pyne is a fire historian and emeritus professor at Arizona State University. He's published 40 books, most of them about fire. Among his recent books are Five Suns, A Fire History of Mexico, also The Pyrocene. And in 2019, he published, closer to home for us, The Northeast, A Fire Survey to the Last Smoke. He is currently revising A Fire History of Europe, some of which he will share with us this morning. As time permits, there may be a short Q&A at the end of Steve's presentation, but rest assured that you will have time to ask questions via the Q&A feature, notably not the chat. Use the Q&A, please. We'll use the Q&A during the panel discussion with all of our speakers at noon. Steve, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Well, and thank you, and my thanks to the organizers for the invitation to speak today. It's quite an honor for me. When I was first approached, I was asked if it was true that I was rewriting A Fire History of Europe, and I replied yes. And we decided that the fire cultures of Europe might be an interesting topic to add to the discussion of cultural burning. And so that's what you're going to get. This is a new presentation for me. I'm able to repurpose a few slides, but fundamentally this is new and it's been fun to put together. So I thank you for that as well. Okay, where are we? I'd like to begin here with the contact period settlement. This is what the pyrogeography of the country looked like according to the 1880 census, which incredibly produced a map of forest fires. Certainly our first national map, and you will notice some interesting features, how much of the Northeast and the Lake States and even the oak woodland savannas are represented. The darker the color, the higher percentage of area burned. Now, this does not include grasslands, sage steppes, deserts, and so forth, or areas that simply didn't have enough people to record. This map records three kinds of fires. nature's fires, lightning, and that's what a map of lightning-caused forest fires looks like for the country. It's practically an inversion of the 1880 map. And the reason is that this is a map of human-caused fires, overwhelmingly. Many of them from the indigenous peoples. And we have lots of accounts of the burning, much of it incidental, but it adds up. This is a famous one, 1878. John Wesley Powell gave one of the founding documents of conservation thinking in the U.S., a report on the arid lands, that is the western U.S. He was focusing primarily on on Utah. And this is part of what he had to say. And Powell at this time was a keen student of the Paiutes and later became the first director of the Bureau of American Ethnology. So he's noting this map on the left is Utah, the white is desert, the green is irrigated land, the bluish patches are forest, and most of these are on these high plateaus of Utah, and all the rest of it, all that kind of orangey tan stuff is burned. So from essentially the edge of the desert up to the rims of the plateaus is being burned. This is primarily being done by the native peoples, not only traditional burning, but settlement is displacing them and they are creating new landscapes, favorable landscapes by burning. This fact, Powell claims, is very well known. And he notes that the fires, to the extent that they are a problem, could be curtailed by the removal of the native peoples. And this is pretty much what happened. What we forget on the other side of that is that the fires are being filled by a new group of people who have their own sets of practices and their own culture, and in many ways are hybridizing with the indigenous practices. Powell later, by the way, got in trouble with foresters in 1890. He crashed, literally broke into the office of the Secretary of the Interior while Gifford Pinchot and Bernard Furneaux were talking about the need for forest reserves and went into some long dissertation about how the way to protect these forests was to burn them in the way the native peoples were. And that, I believe, is where the term Paiute forestry came from, because Powell was identified with that particular group. But this continues, and it's not just in Utah. This is Northern California, an area that has been hit in the last couple of decades, hit and overrun more than once by very large damaging fires. This is the boundary survey for the forest reserve, and it's noted that the newcomer picking up the torch and accustomed to thinking that burning the forest is just a natural part of things. Ranchers, lumbermen, miners, sportsmen, campers, everybody going through has the same attitude, and nobody pays much attention unless a fire threatens a particular settlement or town. So this is not the case where the newcomers came in and had no understanding of fire or no ability to use it. They brought a fire culture with them, and they are beginning to hybridize that culture with what existed before. Lots of accounts of burning. The most spectacular tend to be various kinds of fire drives, although I think that's more of a minor issue, whether it's for grasshoppers in the Great Basin or here, deer in northern Idaho. The painting is interesting because this was done by a French missionary priest in the Coeur d'Alene area, and he is objecting to fire coming out of a pyrophobic culture, northern France. And here they are using the fire to drive the deer and elk into the lake where they could be more easily harvested. And we have examples of this even in the Northeast and tidewater areas and so forth. But they're also burning their encampment. Well, this doesn't happen because where you live and where you burn are separated. But what the message he is conveying here is that they are literally burning their home, their habitat, when they use fire. So we have right from all throughout, we have conflicting views, which brings us to the third source of fire, the newcomers, who had, as I say, their own traditions. And this is a map. Okay, the top map is the 1880 fire map The bottom map is the 1870 census map showing the density of population. And you can see that essentially the map of fire is a map of population. So these really are anthropogenic fires, and they are cultural landscapes. So what did Europe as a fire culture think about fire? And how can understanding the European experience help us to appreciate what happened in this country? Well, fire was long identified in Europe, European culture, certainly even back to antiquity, intellectual culture, as a sign of civilization. Civilized people had greater control over fire. Fire was the index of your advancement. Fire was a model technology, really growing out of cooking. You cook wood, you cook stone, you cook sand, you cook all kinds of materials to make things, and it really was the essence of chemistry. And we can see here in this 16th century rendition how much fire pervades daily life, whether it's in the forge and a workshop, whether it's in the kitchen, the hearth, candles for illumination and ceremony and recreational use. So fire saturates the society as it had to. But it had a number of peculiar features too. This painting of a funerary pyre illustrates, in effect, people are using fire to create what Cicero called a second nature out of first nature. So Europe is a fire civilization. I'm sorry, I got the painting slightly out of sync here. Thought of fire in a built environment. So the painting shows a built environment out of stone, masonry, and so forth. But Europe's built environment was biological, an intensively cultivated landscape. It saw fire as utilitarian. So this background print illustrates that nicely. It saw fire as a social practice. Fire is inseparable from people. People can't exist without fire, but in much of the European experience, fire doesn't really exist apart from its social setting. And intellectuals in particular, and authorities of various kinds, whether academic, political, constabulary, whatever, were never happy with fire. They saw it open fire. They saw it as primitive, messy, and in a fundamental way irrational. That again, the control of fire is a metric of how advanced your particular civilization is, and the greater the control, the better. Fire, in a sense, can go feral. Fire can be unpredictable. Fire is often used by people who move around a lot and escape control by the state. So the classic statement of Europe going back a long time is that fire makes a good servant but a bad master. And I think we might all agree with that, but let's pause and think about the relationship between people and fire conveyed in an expression like that. Again, we are back with this concern about fire escaping control. Lots of fire ceremonies in Europe. All of most of our classic holidays were also fire ceremonies. Here are the May Day celebration on the top, bottom, the Midsummer's fires still practiced ceremonially in some places. Halloween began as a fire ceremony, Yule log for midwinter, and so forth. A very rich variety of settings tied with the agricultural calendar or for the May fall burns with a pastoral calendar when you move the flocks. Again, going back to the ancient world, of the 12 Olympian gods, 2 were fire. So Vesta was the goddess of the hearth, and Vulcan was the god of the forge. Again, going back to that wood print I showed earlier, but this is hardly the emblems of a society that dismisses fire. Uh, they're caught in a kind of, the intellectuals are caught in a kind of dilemma on this. And some of these ceremonies continue today. We just don't recognize them as fire ceremonies, or we don't recognize their heritage. Even Burning Man can be traced back nicely to large effigies constructed and burned for various purposes. So, how did fire get in? Um, Fire was instrumental in colonizing Europe, bringing agriculture. It was somewhat awkwardly called a silvo-agro-pastoralism. So it relied on farming, herding, and managing woods. And that was the spread. That was very difficult to make the transition from a rainy season in the fall, in the winter, to a rainy season in the summer. So it stalled for a while and then continued. The way it continued was by cutting and burning and introducing livestock in to assist that process. And this is an experiment that was done about 70 years ago in Denmark, uh, where they had records of charcoal and what they thought was this early agriculture coming in, and they could see some evidence of it in old bogs preserved. And so they took a couple of stone axe heads out of the museum, put new handles on them, and then they tried to recreate it. So experimental archaeology. And they quickly learned that cutting large trees or even semi-large trees with stone axes was a lot of work. And then all it did was encumber the lot with big chunks of unburnable wood. And what you wanted to do was to girdle the tree, ring bark it, as the Aussies say, and kill it. And then that exposes the area to sun while you actually gather and burn the smaller patches. But you get small patches all over, creating an elaborate mosaic, and much of the biodiversity that Europe would enjoy would be the result of this kind of practice. The Danish term, Norse term for it was landnam, literally land taking, and this is recorded in soil charcoal. So we go from the bottom up. Stage one, you have basically a shade forest, your classic temperate climate European shade forest. And then, oops, sorry, I'm getting way out. And then stage two, it shifts, and you have this line of charcoal. And then afterwards, all different kinds of species come up, including the pollen recorded of weeds, agricultural weeds, and of crops. And then the plot is abandoned. Some of the old stuff recovers, and then you start the process over again. The second time or third time through, you don't have the big trees to deal with as you did the first time. Okay, so as a culture, how did this translate? This is what brings large-scale human settlement into Europe. I think of Europe divided into 5 provinces, parsed mostly by climate. The central area is a temperate climate, actually no natural basis for fire, no wet, dry rhythm, no dry lightning. Mediterranean climate, very well adapted to fire. Boreal, again, fire adapted, but less frequently, a different character. And then you go to the Atlantic, it gets wetter and wetter, and that becomes a point of departure for carrying Europe's fire heritage elsewhere. And you go into the main Eurasian landmass, where it becomes more continental and again creates other opportunities for fire. But wherever you go, the fire matrix, the ecology, if you will, is divided into 3 groups: the field, the flock, and the forest, or what in Latin was known as the ager, from which we get agriculture, the silva, the woods, from which we get silviculture, and the saltus, which wasn't cultivated in the same way, which is basically pasture land. And agriculture is the organizing principle. And one reason this hasn't been recognized as fire ecology or even as a fire culture is because so much of fire science grew up, was itself cultivated in large wildlands created during the colonial period, in which people were removed and fire was seen as a natural process or something humans intruded on, and was not, and that was what fire ecology meant. And this simply wasn't a part of what you studied. So let's look at each of these in a way and think of some of the ways fire works. So fire in field, the agar. Swidden is the somewhat clumsy term for slash and burn agriculture. The term was invented in 1951. Actually, it was a term the Norse Vikings used to describe the burning of the moors, the land in northern England, and then was reclaimed and repurposed as a generic term because there are hundreds of terms around the world, thousands of terms for this, according to local circumstances and people. These are some examples from Finland. A photograph from the 1890s, a famous painting from the 1870s, and the reason the people are ragged and the girl is so sad, the child, is not that they're burning. The problem is that they don't own the land that they're burning. They are a class of migrant workers who simply go around doing the burning. So think of this as the predecessor to prescribed fire crews tooling around the countryside doing the burning for others. In this case, this is a social protest movement, and they had special clothes which they wore for it, particularly like the birch sandals and so forth. And they had different terms for the different categories of prescribed fire in these circumstances. Oops. We can find other examples of this here in Steiermark, in the Austrian Alps. Alp, by the way, meant mountain pasture. And this is how they kept the pasture from being overgrown with trees. They would go up and burn, and they had these long poles for helping to control it. And was routinely done. And this is how you maintain, even you can see how far up they are in the distance. You can see the village down below. Or here in uh, southern Denmark, they're burning basically organic soils. So they're burning peat. In this case, not chopping the peat up and carrying it to burn in a hearth or a furnace, but chopping it up and then burning it. Or in some cases, and probably here, you can control the water table by introducing some small canals to drain off the water, and then as far down as the water goes, that's how much will burn. And here they are sort of doing their burning. And this is slash and burn. It's just instead of using wood or shrubs, you're doing it with organic soil. And you can see the close attention to personal protective equipment at work here. The problem here was that a lot of that smoke traveled to cities. And so there was a huge uproar by cities to shut it down in the name of public health. The other way, instead of moving the farm around the landscape, cycling it through the landscape, you have a fixed plot and then you cycle the crops that grow there. You control the ecological succession, if you will, and this use of fields. So you would have some part of um, your arable would be left in fallow, and the norm usually was about a third, sometimes a half. Sometimes it could go up 5 or 6 years before you recycled it. But at some point, you need the ecological jolt provided by fire to renew the process. And the fallow just infuriated those in control of society, the authorities, because they saw it as potentially cultivatable land that was not growing anything useful. Well, what it was growing was fuel. In this kind of system, if you want fire, you have to grow the fuel to burn, and that's what fallowing was. So the fallowing wasn't burned to get rid of it after a period of rest or whatever explanations might be offered. It was grown in order to be burned. And there are all kinds of systematic ways of doing this. And if you don't have enough fallow, you bring it in. You rake under the woods. Um, and throw extra pine needles and leaves on. You distribute dung on it. There are stories in British Isles of gathering seaweed, hauling that on, letting that dry out to add to the fire. And the example on the left also shows how they would take some of the larger debris and organize it on the slopes to prevent erosion. And we can see this again in many parts of the world. This is interesting. This in 1926, a series of photos was taken in Småland, Sweden, which shows the whole cycle. And we're talking a century ago. We're still doing this. So here we are. This is the original plot. It's been chopped, and now they're chopping it, mincing it up further. And then they will eventually try to get an even spread of these finer fuels around. And then they light it and continue lighting, and they work to protect the wood fence. They don't want it to get on that. And they continue. And then they will continue to roll new stuff over the burning, smoldering area to get more fire. The better the fire, the better the crop is going to be. And so they continue to go back, sort of reamass and reignite this. And then eventually they burned as much as they're going to, so they collect the wood, which they can use for fencing, or they may use it for firewood. And then they sow, they reap, and they dry. And if it's too wet, they will erect the drying racks in a barn and uh, light some fires in the barn to smoke and help dry out the seed. So that's a whole cycle, and this is still going. This is not casual burning. This is very meticulous burning. Uh, okay, but you also have animals in this mix, and how do the animals feed in? How do they go? Well, there are a variety of ways depending on terrain, climate, and so forth. Part of it is well integrated with the farm. I realize that drawing, it's a lovely drawing. It's a little hard to see, but basically what you have is an infield and an outfield. This is where these terms come from. And the infield has permanent gardens or small fields, and they can manure them with the dung from animals, so forth. And they would, then the outfield would be swiddened. So you're burning the permanent crops as part of that rotation, but you would also have swidden plots. Then the swidden plots would be kept, would be burned routinely, and you would create rough pasture, and so you can use the animals outside as well. Another is to seasonally separate the field and the flock. So the men would stay. This again is from the Baltic area. And the men would stay with the field and do that heavy labor. The women and children would go off to these cider cabins for the summer, and the area would be burned, part of the rough pasture, keeping the browse fresh. And then they would raise goats, sheep, and so forth for their fleece, and especially for their milk, because the milk can be made into butter and cheese and things that can provide food over the winter. So you see this sort of seasonal movement within families, and this also extends, and you can see this in the Alps where you go up and down the hills accordingly. A lot of rough pasture, all the stuff that couldn't be cultivated, a lot of the moors, stuff where you can't grow. It's too hard to cultivate the land, even with paring and burning, as it was called. And these are left for grazing. And lots of this is how partly this was how many of these were created originally, removing the trees. The trees acted as kind of biotic windmills, and they would help transpire away a lot of the ground moisture. When they were removed, then you couldn't control the land became waterlogged, and so you would just graze it and burn it. The other form was particularly uh, applicable in Mediterranean Europe, where you have not just a Mediterranean climate, but large mountains. And you would carry the flocks up the mountain in the summer and down to the valley in the winter. And part of the valley stuff, they may be feeding on some fallow up to a point. And these were really very large operations. And then in Spain had a special one where they practiced because of the long, centuries long fight against the Moors, the Reconquista, driving back from the northwest, eventually arriving in Spain over the course of probably 5 or 6 centuries. And they would carry the flocks with them as they took to the field each summer. And then as they acquired more land, the trail routes became longer and longer and longer, and eventually they're crossing large expanses of the Spanish plain. And these wool was so valuable that there were special royal monopolies for it, and they were granted special rights to burn to help support the flocks as they go. And as you can see in the image on the right, these were not just sort of free ranging, whatever they can go. There were restrictions on where you can burn, when you can burn, and so forth. So what about the forest? Well, some of the woods would be cultivated as orchards, citrus, olives, certainly, hazel, and so forth. But a lot could also be used for fuel, for charcoal, and coppicing. Both of these fire related, providing fuel for fire. This is from southern Sweden, Småland, and it shows the magnitude of different products you got out of the forest: tar, potash, and charcoal. All of these produced through the use of fire, some of them to be reburned. These was a major industry for cultivating the woods. A lot of rough pasture. Again, selective burning at the right time could keep this open enough that you could graze in it as well. A lot of fruits and berries, and then, of course, farms. And this is a sample of some of these farm plots. Again, this is sort of in central Sweden. The Swedes are particularly good, and the Finns are particularly good about mapping all this stuff historically. So the stippled area, the Svedja, are the burn plots, and the rest of the white is forest, and the rest are various lakes or wetlands. And you can see that, again, this is not industrial clearing. This is very selective. You would have people who would be scouts, and they would scout ahead to find likely sites. And then once you get it up, then you could go back to it after a period of years. But you would have to have 3 or 4 years advanced preparation to be able to have it all come into focus. And then forestry. Forestry identified some of the major sites for it, originated in temperate Europe. And that really matters because temperate Europe is one of these anomalous parts of the world that doesn't have a regular wet-dry cycle, doesn't have a natural basis for fire. And so the fires that were put in here are all the result of human activity. Forestry was used to reclaim the sort of rough pasture, what they called wastelands, or damaged watersheds where clearing on mountain areas had been overdone and led to flooding or torrents, as they were called. And some of these would be massive projects, state-sponsored. This is one in the southwestern part of France near Bordeaux, huge sand dunes left from Pleistocene glaciations. And here they are replanted, and you can see the extensiveness of this project. And this would be a typical pine plantation. So primary fuel breaks, secondary fuel breaks, there's a railroad going through, and then the top part shows the intensive cultivation that occurred on the side of the railroad. And that was how you solved the problem. You compartmentalized it with cultivation, close manipulation of the vegetation, plus your own burning. But foresters feared and hated fire. It really was kind of a blood enemy. Completely irrational in my mind because they saw fire as an enabling device for their traditional enemies, farmers and herders. And this is a forest in the in Provence in southern France, actually not far from part of the mountains just behind the Riviera. And this was studied by a group of Americans in 1920, and they're talking about this was the premier fire protection site for Europe. This was where you took the field trips. The foresters were taking the field. This is how you, in a fire-prone area, this is how you can stop fire. And it was very intensively managed. And in fact, it cost so much to prevent fire that it cost much more than the revenue they could get from resin and cork and a few other minor and timber that they could. But it didn't matter. You were going to show you were going to do it, and this was the test case. It was worth any expense. You would get it later. You could drive the cost down, but this had to show it was possible. Defying the peasants and all the other people who were using fire all over the place, we wanted to show we can control it. And they note here that the clearing of the underbrush is not just all the fuel breaks and the rest, because they're ineffective when the wind is high. You had to clear the underbrush, and they actually went in and pulled it out by the roots in places to break the possibility of large fires. It's really kind of insane, but this is where a lot of colonial foresters were taken, both the British and French, and our two first chief foresters also spent some time. In one case, Graves went through the entire British imperial program, and this is what they saw. When do you have fires in this setting? When there's a breakdown in the environmental or social order. It's no longer being tended. They can't do that anymore. And they can't, they did have some, what they call little fires, petit feux, and that was condemned. The lectures at all the forestry schools blanket condemned it. But it went on nonetheless because it had to. But this is when it breaks down. So this is the land area where it was these huge afforestation projects had occurred. And in fact, a couple of years ago, a massive fire burned in this area. It's the largest afforestation project in Europe, and this it broke out again. And this is a record of burned area from Provence. This would be in the southeastern part of southern France. And you can see the major outbreaks occur with social breakdown. World War I, the Depression, World War II, and then this rapid transition out of traditional burning, out of traditional way of life into a modern agriculture, and in effect, the onset of modernity. An awkward word, but I'm going to stick with it for a bit here. So our first professional forester in the U.S., Bernard Furneaux, head of the Bureau of Forestry, the predecessor to the Forest Service, married an American woman, came from Prussia, and brought forestry to the U.S. Later, he set up the forestry school at Cornell, and then later went to Toronto and was instrumental in setting it up for Canada. He looked at the American fire scene and dismissed it as one of bad habits and loose morals. Because in his training and in his world, all of these fires were simply a metric of ill behavior. The landscape was uncontrolled. The landscape was feral because the society was not organized. Partly because it's moving, it's settling, and so forth, but simply it didn't have the kind of society that forestry required. Okay, let's think about Europe as the fire colonizer. And I say I've got to get going here. Colonizing beyond Europe, the Norse carried Landnam across the islands. And you see the same record from the islands off the coast of Norway all the way through. You see forest layers of peat. This is a soil profile. Then you see a layer of charcoal, classic Landnam signature, and then it converts. It converts in this case to a moor, a Kaluna moor, and you see routine layers of charcoal dust maintained by burning and grazing. And this is, you can see when they arrive, this is it. Okay, beyond Europe, it occurs in two waves. One led by the Spanish and Portuguese. We think of this in political terms. More recently, we've recognized the ecological implications, introducing new plants, which interfere or encourage burning. Livestock, huge amounts of livestock, totally rewrite the ecology, fire ecology of large landscapes. And of course, diseases which are mostly responsible for the collapse of indigenous populations. This is the central Mexico. In roughly 60 years, the population declined 90%. Well, this was an intensively cultivated landscape. Cortez said not a palm of land was untended, and now the tenders are gone. So this is overturned. The second wave begins, led primarily by Britain and France in the latter part of the 18th century. There's also a shift here in European thinking about fire. So here's a Dutch naturalist saying that you've got to get fire right because it's fundamental for everything in 1720. Here's Carl Linnaeus, 1750. Linnaeus, yeah, that Linnaeus, the guy who gave us systematics, one of the great figures of Enlightenment science. 1750, the King of Sweden asked him to report on natural resources and conditions in Skåne, the most recent of Sweden's provinces acquired from Denmark. And Linnaeus had a section on some moranic soil, and he says, well, they burn it here for pasture. The Ministry of Agriculture forced him to delete that passage from his official report before it would be published and put in an alternative passage about the value of manure. Because the belief was as long as you were using fire, you are a primitive, you are locked into a primitive agriculture, and you will never be able to progress. It is literally irrational. So Linnaeus, the Newton of natural history in his day, was forced to recant, which I conclude burning can't compete with bullshit. And this shift, we're about to see a big shift as Europe gears up for its second age. There's a scientific revolution. The discovery of oxygen changes how Western science understood fire. There's a technological revolution, epitomized by the steam engine, which changed how fire could be applied to restructure the ways people live on the earth. And fire changes its character. Michael Faraday in 1848 could adopt a candle as a way of explaining the great principles of modern science. And again, takes us, but we're talking now about not fire on landscapes, but fire in machines, fire in various appliances, which is how you can further control fire. So fire is removed from its natural habitat. It's deconstructed into combustion, and it's abstracted into energy, and we really have no science of landscape fire. Lots and lots of use, effectively no science. And then these new machines help to power the dissemination of Western concepts and institutions through colonies. So there's a transition underway here, which accompanies this second wave of settlement. Fire had always been a part of living landscapes, 420 million years, give and take between vegetation and fire. When we convert to burning fossil fuels, or what I think of as lithic landscapes, once living, now fossilized, all that changes. There are no checks and balances. You can burn day and night, winter, summer, wet or dry, it doesn't matter. There's lots and lots of stuff to burn. We keep finding more of it. The problem is where to put the effluent. In a sense, I think of this as geology's version of Jurassic Park, where you've taken something out of deep time, you plunked it down into the modern world, and then are surprised at the results. Well, in some ways, it doesn't belong in this world. So it begins remaking all of these. So let's go back to that wood block of fire in society. Changes domestic fires. It changes urban fires. Cities were made of the same stuff as the surrounding landscapes. They used to be, now they aren't. They burn the same way, now they don't. Changed agriculture. You don't need to fallow anymore because we have petrochemicals and we have machines to deliver it. All of it is a result of this conversion to this new source of matter and energy. And then we apply this same process to wildlands as we begin setting land aside. And if you took away our machines, we would not be able to pretend to control fire in any large sense. So I would take this transition, the ideas, the institutions, the technologies, let's roll all this up into something we can call modernity and how this has remade fire. In the really big picture, we have what we might call first fire, nature's fire, going back 420 million years. Second fire, people work within sort of, nature's elastic. It can be pushed and pulled and reshaped, and they recode all the pulses and patches of fire, leaving only the untended areas available to lightning. They expand the domain of fire. And as we come to this third fire, burning fossil fuels, you can see I'm no graphic artist. I'm trying to create a time dimension here, passing through. We change it again. And if you look at large satellite views of Earth at night, we often see all the city lights, but we don't often pay attention to the lights from the fires. So we have two realms here, one still dominated by second fire and one by third fire. Not all of those lights are powered by combustion. Increasingly, Europe is making the transition to renewables, has lots of hydropower. France has a big nuclear facilities. But this is a world that is made by that fire overall. And what happens is that second fire gets dropped out. It's pretty much the story in the US. And we're left with a paradox that these really large damaging fires, the ones that are running into and incinerating cities, have become a pathology of the developed world. I mean, the countries that have the greatest wealth, the most science, the most robust technology are the ones that are being hit by these. We have created a world where this is now the kind of fires that we get. So we begin recolonizing Europe, let's call it with this modernity. And it's an interesting story because you take this conception, which grew up in Central Europe, the non-natural fire part of Europe, and it has to cross boundaries. And how you impose that Central European notion onto very different and fire-prone landscapes is a fascinating story within Europe, and that it's going to be the same story that happens as we carry it beyond Europe. And we see a whole wave with settlement of bad fires, broken fire regimes, in effect, fire plagues. Here's Gifford Pinchot identifying fire as the most terrible threat to the woodlands of North America. And we take a series of steps to protect these forests from fire and axe, as it was called, because the fires followed the axe. We're at the end of the Little Ice Age, so it's not climatically driven. This is just by landscapes lathered in fuel. And that's what accounts for these large fires, 1903, 1908 fires, say, in the Northeast. The foresters claimed this role. This was a global project. Here's the example of British India creating forest reserves. They're the same creation of public lands for the US. Dietrich Brandis, the German who created the project for India, was a mentor for Gifford Pinchot. And so we see similar kinds of fire programs across the globe. And if you're a fan of Kipling, you may wonder what happens to Mowgli. Well, after he grows up in the man village, he joins the Indian Forest Service and becomes a fire guard. Okay, so we transfer a lot of these institutions as they come over and practices. What happens? A lot of this is occurring before this sort of second wave, but the second wave accompanies a demographic migration. Something like 60 million Europeans moved out of Europe in a little over a century, emigrated. And that changed things, which was not true earlier. Spanish pastoralism, we talked about this in various forms, long trail drives, all of this stuff gets transferred over. And it's the hybridization occurs really in Texas and then all our trail drives, all this other stuff, the whole apparatus, even the terms. What about that other form of transhumance to mountains? This was carried over primarily by Basques from the Pyrenees and Cantabrians, and here we are in the American West. And we can see the result here is not this explosion of slash-powered fires, but the elimination of the grass, which had carried fire. So the breakage of the fire regime 30 years before the Forest Service had created. So where that was practiced in the Southwest, arid areas, that was the problem. In the Northwest, where the rains were higher, it led to more and more burning. And even the Finns transfer over. The Finns had developed a kind of pioneering technology with the slash and burn, long hunts, this whole thing. And moving out of that sort of hearthland, they were brought in. The Swedes tended to stay on the coast. The Finns were interior. The Finns were deliberately brought in, transplanted into the interior of Sweden to begin cultivating, bringing that in. And then they were transferred to New Sweden. Which became and then hybridized with the local peoples and created fire practices within a mix of other practices, which then carried across the country. So clashing as foresters become more important, there's a controversy. People on the ground, the settlers, the newcomers, bringing their own fire practices or hybridizing, as we've seen with what the indigenous people had, are very keen on burning. Foresters categorically dislike it. In 1910, the same month as the big blowup in the Northern Rockies, a controversy erupted called light burning, which argued that we really should be emulating the American Indian and practicing light burning. And this was seen as a direct challenge to the Forest Service, to conservation, to the whole conceptions of fire. And it was a bitterly fought controversy that did not end until the early 1920s. And here's Aldo Leopold, for heaven's sakes, arguing that the Forest Service policy of preventing all fires as much as possible is threatened by light burning propaganda, showing how intensely this issue was received. And here's the report that finally ended it, gave official sanction to declaring light burning anathema and condemning it. In 1923, in Northern California, they note that as soon as the forests were established, routine burning was already everywhere. We've seen that. And then as fire protection became a little more intense, fuels began building up. Everybody saw this. And the locals were furious and wanted to reintroduce burning legally or illegally to reduce it. But foresters insisted that all that young stuff was the forest of the future, that we are in a crisis, a timber famine that will starve the industrial growth of the country. We have to preserve all this stuff. And so here they are, and they're arguing not only were the fires a threat, but the whole argument that forestry got it wrong was seen as a challenge. Here in the Southeast, the Florida National Forest, 1911, talking about everybody burns. I mean, not really much different from California, except you can do it year round here. And everybody thinks that burning is just fine. And that not burning is the problem. And we need to include tall timbers. It's fire ecology conferences. A lot of what they were trying to talk about was a recovery of traditional burning. There's Herbert Stoddard, sort of the patriarch of the process and the emblem of it. And the cooperative quail study showing that the traditional burning is what created the habitat that was necessary. But we already had a predecessor to that 20 years earlier, just as these hunting plantations in the Red Hills were based on Scottish hunting plantations, primarily for grouse. So there was a crisis in Scotland, and the grouse were dying out. Everything was falling apart. Special parliamentary commission was hosted, and they concluded that it's doubtful that the problem was lack of fire. And it's doubtful you could burn too much, provided the burning was done in patches. So again, Europe intersects and in some ways anticipates. Okay, what about regional fire cultures? In my recent survey, I think of it three. One in the Southeast, centered on prescribed fire. Okay, we know this group knows that. One in California, centered on suppression. Uh, any fire story in the Southeast eventually gets to prescribed burning. Almost any story in California, once it gets going, ends in suppression, whether people want it or not. And the third is sort of the Northern Rockies, which is about big fires in a big landscape. And those three, I think, really shaped the current scene. We have some regional cultures that have national influence, particularly the Flint Hills and prairie burning, and Alaska, of course. And I would note that the prairie fires have a long cultural tradition. We have an unbroken tradition of painting prairie fires since the 1830s. This is the most artful of our fire habitats. The Southeast, of course, celebrates the longleaf pine. California, the giant sequoia, all of which are tied with fire. So we do have regional cultures and lots of smaller cultures within it, but these, I think, are the main ones. And they were important in the reforms, the policy reforms in the 60s and 70s, particularly the Tall Timbers group wanted to restore the culture of burning. They weren't looking to native peoples. They were looking to the rural communities of the Southeast, particularly in longleaf pine. And these people had lots and lots of problems. In many ways, a society degraded by its segregation, its kind of racial apartheid system. But nonetheless, on fire, they had it right. And in California, it was to restore natural fire. Okay. Which leads us to a comparison then, I think, between Europe and America. Europe, here we have the American scene in the north, Thomas Cole painting, so earth, air, fire, and water, all the elements. The European scene back from the 15th century, late 15th century, fire in the center. But this is really a landscape populated with people and animals and cultivated in some ways. So early 90s, Johann Gutzblum, a Dutch sociologist, published a book called Fire and Civilization. Okay, and this is the cover he used for his book, which you've seen before. And it's clear that fire is seen as a social construction in a cultural landscape. And wildfires result when that system breaks down. This is the American edition, same book. Well, I see a lot of fire. I don't see much civilization. Fire was seen as a natural phenomenon, which people muck with and do things with. And wildfires could be natural and even encouraged, or they could be the result of human misbehavior. Two very different perspectives, two different relationships to fire. So in Europe, we look at the fire scene. This is mapped by the European Forest Fire Information System, the Copernicus satellite. And this is for the 2023 season. What do we see? Where are the fires? Well, they're in the Northwest Iberia, a land which has the wetter part of Iberia, and a land with a lot of social breakdown. People have left the country. Areas have been replanted to industrial plantation. Other areas where people have abandoned it, abandoned landscapes in southern Italy, Sicily, Greece, for heaven's sakes, others making the transition in the Balkans, and a large swath in Ukraine, war. So here it is, social breakdown, war, and a changing climate. So the European conception of fire actually works pretty well in Europe. The problem is, how do you move it out? So the US, it's our 1880 map, and this is wildfire activity mapped by FEMA. Again, almost an inversion. It's the result of having large, expansive public lands and what is considered more or less natural conditions. So the two groups are moving closer together over the last few years. So Europeans recognize that there's an ecological value in fire, a necessity perhaps. The US is beginning to recognize that all landscapes are cultural, even wilderness. Wilderness is created by legal decisions enforced by political means. It's a choice we make, maybe a great choice, but still a cultural landscape. We can't take ourselves out of it, and we can't take ourselves out of fire. So there's really a convergence over the last few years, but we still see some differences. And the differences might be expressed in the burning of communities, which have become so much of an issue recently. Here's Madi in Greece on the left and Paradise, California on the right. The Europeans define the problem here as people moving out of fire-prone landscapes. Okay, the city needs to harden itself to protect against these fires, but the fundamental problem is nobody's tending the landscape anymore. And so it is simply growing up feral, which births feral fires. The US seen this interpreted as people moving into fire-prone areas and hence intruding into areas that should be burning and allowing to burn. So what I think they both share is the recognition that we need to harden our communities. This is ridiculous that these fires are happening, but we also need to actively manage the landscape surrounding it, but actively manage for fire resilience. It doesn't mean just dumping flocks of sheep and cattle. It doesn't mean clear cutting. It doesn't mean a lot of other things. It means managing for fire. And if you don't manage for fire, then active forest management is just hypocrisy for logging or other commodity production. And so we have these horrific fires in, say, northern Portugal mountain area, which had used to be divided up into this intricate mosaic for which fire was used all over the place, but in small, contained, regulated forms. And now it's either planted to industrial plantations, highly combustible, or just overgrown. And I'm also struck by the recency of many of these changes. Europeans are still practicing fire fallow agriculture after World War I, in some places even after World War II. This is really a recent change over the last 60, 70 years. Okay, I'm going to leave Europe in the US now for a very quick view, which I hope will be helpful, and go to Australia because the visuals work here. This is a famous painting, Black Thursday Fire, 1851 in Victoria, Australia. This is the Malakuta fire in 2020. And I invite you to look at the settings. So in 1851, transport was by horse, mule, ox cart, bullock. In 2020, it's all by petrol-powered machines. In 1851, the people were people living on the land. They were raising flocks. They were doing some farming. They were prospecting for gold. This is the cusp of the gold fields for Australia. In 2020, they're basically tourists or a service industry. And then the material. All the stuff had been basically things out of the living world in 1851. Now they're plastics. They're all things made with fossil biomass. So we've created two different worlds. And so Europe and cultural burning, well, culture of fire is all over Europe. We're still left with many, many relics of it. There is still much to learn. Europeans have finally decided they need to recover their cultural burning if they're going to survive this wave of outbreaks of fires. And the meanings of cultural burning, it's mostly been sequestered into indigenous discussions and decolonizing discussions. but I think we're beyond just living with fire. Fire is a part of living. And what we really need to talk about is cultural burning as a species. That's our heritage. Okay, well, I went a little longer than I thought, but I think we still have some time, I hope.
That was great,
And
Steve. We're right at the end. We have a couple of minutes. I saw one question in the Q&A. If you want to try and answer that, it's a specific one. I don't know if you can see it in the Q&A, but Rachel's asking about the poles that were being used in a lot of that early European burning, particularly in Sweden. And
yeah,
just
this was
what
this they used very long poles, and they tended to have an iron hook at the end. And the hook was simply for rolling the logs, so they didn't have to stand in the fire in the smoke. They could reach over and move it around because they didn't just light it and leave it. They needed to burn that stuff so that they could sew in it. They needed to have it gone. They also wanted the nutrients. They needed the ash, and they wanted as level of burning and even as burning as possible, so the fields weren't distorted. And so they would use the poles to do that. And we see this all over Europe.
interesting technique. All right, we have a couple more that have popped up here. We've got another minute before
And I'm going to be on the panel. I'll be available for
right
questions.
before our break. Let me just scan real quick and see if any of these are specific to you or if we can wait.
Okay.
No, I think all of these are questions that we'll put in our back pocket for the panel this afternoon with the three of you. We are now up to our scheduled 10-minute break. So, Steve, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. That presentation was fantastic, and particularly that you clearly took a lot of time to put that together specifically for this workshop, and that's tremendously appreciated.
Well, it was a labor of love. It was an intellectual challenge, trying to get the visuals and the message and all of it. It was a lot of work, but I'm really pleased to have done it, and thank you for the invitation to make it possible. Okay, we'll see you after break.
All right, thank you. So we have a break now, folks. Michael, thank you all again for joining us, and welcome back. Like all of you, I am looking forward to our next session, Many Cultures of Fire, and I'm honored to introduce our two speakers, whom I will introduce individually for each of their presentations. Again, please note that unless we find ourselves with extra time, we will not take questions at the end of their respective presentations. Please feel free to populate the Q&A, which we will visit during this afternoon's panel discussion. Importantly, please remember the Q&A guidelines that Dave Salino previewed at the beginning of the day. Bazile, while I go over your introduction, if you want to share your screen and get started, that would be great. It is a privilege to introduce our second speaker of the day, someone who has generously contributed to the last two annual workshops, Bazile Minagijigabo Panek. Bazile comes from the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe, where he was born and raised. His culture is an integral part of his life, and he consistently participates in cultural events and ceremonies. He is now the founder and chief executive officer of Good Sky Guidance, the consulting firm specializing in the integration of indigenous knowledges and culture into environmental initiatives and advising institutions on respectful tribal community engagement. Bazile also works as the Fire Plan Research Coordinator at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville for a National Science Foundation funded project that combines various ways of knowing to help heal fire-dependent lands and cultures in the Great Lakes region. He is a sought-after speaker on topics such as indigenous environmentalism, traditional ecological knowledge, decolonization, and cultural revitalization. He has spoken all across the United States. Bazile's guiding philosophy in life is to, quote, honor my ancestors by becoming an honorable ancestor for future generations. Something we could all aspire to. With that, thank you for joining us, Bazile. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Neil. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jack. Thanks for all of the organizers for this amazing conference and this workshop that we're all get to spend time with each other this week. So honored to have this invitation to speak with you all this morning, especially following such an amazing person, Stephen Pyne. So I will be sharing a presentation today. So let me try to figure out how to share my screen. Right. Could I get a thumbs up from Neil or Michael
Looks good.
if you're able to see that? Okay, sweet. Thanks, Michael. Awesome. So yeah, the when they asked me to speak, they said the many cultures of fire is this session title. So I thought obviously the ask was for me to present my culture of fire. And I think there are many ways to go about that. What is my personal culture of fire? What is my family's relationship, my family's culture of fire? And I brought it to the indigenous peoples. The group of indigenous peoples are the Ojibwe, whom I belong to. So I wanted to talk about the Ojibwe culture of fire today. I'll introduce myself first. Bujun Ninjinwe Magnadug, Minwan Nijpamata Sijig, Minogi Jagabo Indigenakaz, Gamasquabi Kong and Dunchba, Migazi and Dodame. Niwiwanish Quetagos, I'm going to humbly interrupt and speak. My name is Bazile Minogi Jagabo Panek. I come from the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, uh, also known as the Ojibwe people. The Ojibwe people are the indigenous peoples that surround the Great Lakes region. So, I am the founder and chief executive officer of Good Sky Guidance, a consulting firm working to integrate Indigenous knowledge into environmental initiatives, also Indigenous knowledge and culture, guide institutions on respectful tribal community engagement. Um, I'm the research coordinator for that National Science Foundation funded project. It's titled Merging Diverse Knowledge Systems to Advance Restoration of Fire Dependent Lands and Cultures in the Great Lakes region. I'll share a little bit more about that later in the presentation. I'll also be a graduate student this fall at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, studying a master's in natural resource sciences and management, and then a PhD in American and Indian studies. I'm scared, terrified about getting back into school again, but I've heard that people think it'll go okay for me. So appreciate that, and I am excited as well. Wanted to share a fun fact about myself. I'm actually fluent in a foreign language. That language is English, a language that does not come from here and was not originally spoken on these lands. So my people, the Ojibwe people, have carried a culture of fire um, through generations since time immemorial. Our intimate relationships with the land have included fire as not so much as a land management tool, but a practice of working with the land and living with the land. I'd like to begin by sharing a story with you about how this culture of fire developed within our Ojibwe community. Mewinja, a long time ago, the people were cold and hungry. At that time, they didn't have access to fire to help warm our homes and ourselves. We were huddled close together in an attempt to keep each other warm. We were freezing. We didn't have these campfires that were available to us now. At this time, one of our relatives, Ondig, the crow, had beautiful feathers. They were all colors of the rainbow. Ondig had a beautiful voice that sang beautiful songs to our people. This bird saw the people who were cold and hungry and decided to help them. Ondig traveled to visit the Great Spirit or the Creator or God, however you see them, and asked them for help. The Creator, seeing how much Ondig had cared about the people, decided to share some Ishgode or fire. The Creator shared Ishgode with Ondig so that Ondig could share it with the people. The creator passed over a burning branch to Ondig. As Ondig traveled from the creator's home back to the people to bring the fire, the burning branch had started to burn hotter and hotter. It started to hurt Ondig and scorch his feathers. He flew faster and faster and called to the people telling them to be ready for the gift that Ondig was bringing. By the time Ondig finally arrived, the the fire had scorched and blackened Ondig's feathers. He began to share the story of fire and how he received it. When he spoke to the people, his voice came out harsh and raspy because the fire had burned his throat. Despite the scorched feathers and throat, Ondig continued to share the story of fire and how to use it. He shared with the people how the fire will keep people warm, it will help them cook, and how it can help forests. Ondig, the crow, shared this gift with the people. He sacrificed his beauty and his voice for us. Next time you pick up a crow feather, hold it up to the sun, turn it, and you can see some shimmers of blue within it, which are the remnants of those feathers with all colors of the rainbow that Ondig once had. So we thank Crow and we are grateful to Crow for the gift of Ishkode or fire. After receiving this gift of fire, the Ojibwe began to not only use fire to heat our homes and to cook, but to help our forests. Our forests were taking care of us, and now it was time for us to take care of them. We began to use fire in various ecosystems, just barren communities, and red and white pine stands, other various ecosystems in which culturally important and medicinal species exist. We cleared the forest floors of dead materials. We aided the increase of biodiversity, created healthy homes for the largest animals to the smallest insects. This was a living, thriving culture of fire. Trees are telling us these stories of a culture of fire. We can often look to our relative Red Pine, who is a great holder of these stories. They tell stories to us when we take a look at their rings that hold stories of fire frequency and intensity, seasonality, weather, and growth patterns. They have so much to tell us, so much to say. The red pine that exists within Ojibwe territory tells us stories about low intensity, high frequency fire regimes. We can learn this through their reading their tree rings and listening to the stories that they have to tell. Specifically on the Stockton Island of the Apostle Islands National Lake Shore, for example, through paleological records developed by Robert Booth et al. By using pollen, charcoal, and testate amoeba through cores of peat and sediment. It shows that fire has been an integral part of the ecology of Stockton Island for at least 6,000 years. Before these paleological records were gathered, indigenous knowledge holders, specifically from the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior Chippewa and the Bad River Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, had consistently shared their memories of the use of fire on this island. Their oral stories and histories have told us that fires happened frequently. The paleological records supported this by demonstrating that fires occurred about every 4 to 8 years. So this was an I told you so moment from the indigenous peoples at this time. Since this study and these conversations happened, a burn was permitted in 2017 that allowed fire to return to the land after over 100 years. This image is from that burn. So we ask why did these fires stop? And I thought that Stephen Pyne had a great way to explain why these fire regimes had ended and why people were changing their minds about fire. For the Ojibwe people, our use of fire stopped partially because of the cessation of lands through the treaties of 1836, 1837, 1842, and 1854. This was the sale of lands in which we retained our rights to hunt, fish, and gather within, but we lost that full control over those lands. It was also through basic land dispossession by the United States government, land dispossession of the Ojibwe people and many native groups throughout the United States. It was through the criminalization of practices by the Ojibwe people, banning our ability to use fire on landscapes that need it. It was also through policies such as the Dawes Act that prevented communal land management and land stewardship, widespread fire suppression policies that were put into place during the early 1900s that stated that all fire was bad and needed to be suppressed, mainly in order to protect the profits of the lumber industry. There was a law passed on May 5th, 1900, that was passed by Congress that forbids setting fire to the woods. So any controlled burns, many of which at the time were set by indigenous peoples. The United States Forest Service later, after its creation, was allowed to arrest people, quote, without warrant and charge them $5,000 or imprisonment for 2 years or both. Quote, if fire is set maliciously. $5,000 in 1900 is over $190,000 in today's money. And I'll call back that quote. If a fire is set maliciously, who gets to decide what is malicious? The general understanding of indigenous peoples and their burning and fire overall is that was bad, that is malicious, and that was the general understanding. Studies in oral knowledge tell us that Ojibwe people were setting these fires at the time intentionally, and that these were fires that were helping the landscapes. However, these laws and policies cause an absence of cultural ignition, the removal of an act of a culture of fire. Not only do trees tell stories, but people tell stories too. The Ojibwe only recently began writing things down. Before then, we were an oral culture that told stories, shared knowledge, and relayed critical information all through verbal communication. The fact that things were only shared orally heightened their importance. You may only hear this story once, so you better pay attention, is something that I have heard my elders told me many times when sharing their oral knowledge. Stories were and shared by all generations, but we mostly look to our elders as the storytellers of our communities, as they have gained a lot of knowledge throughout their long life. The listeners of these oral stories preserved them within their minds and shared them with others, especially the younger generations who would grow up to tell stories to their younger generations, and so on. The story I shared earlier about how Ondig gifted us fire was shared to me by elders as well as my mother, Nisogabo Melanie Montano. I hope to share this story with my children someday, and I hope that they will share it with theirs. Stories like Ondig and fire are still shared today. Individuals tell stories about their grandparents using fire on the land, the plentiful seas of blueberries in areas that have burned in years prior, their harvesting of sacred medicines that have come up out of the soil after being rejuvenated by fire. We would like to listen to these stories more. So a team of academics, fire practitioners, cultural knowledge holders, and overall some really nerdy people, some fire nerds, have come together to foster spaces where these stories are shared. Our project is titled Merging Diverse Knowledge Systems to Advance Restoration of Fire-Dependent Lands and Cultures in the Great Lakes region. We've been conducting listening sessions with tribal communities in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, where we gather around a fire if the weather allows for a semi-facilitated conversation where people are able to share stories about their own culture of fire that exists within themselves. We are calling these fireside conversations. We begin these conversations with an opening ceremony, which is usually led by a elder or knowledge holder from the hosting community, uh, and that includes an opening prayer. My grandfather and an elder of the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, Frank Anaquad Montano, conducted the opening ceremony for our fireside conversation in Red Cliff. During his ceremony, he asked us to embrace fire as our relative, to be comfortable with that relative, and to further our relationship with them. He asked us to go around the circle and share our personal relationships with fire. Many shared stories of their wood stove that they were taught to stoke as throughout the night as a child. Their memories of the stories of fire with their grandparents that they shared with them, or an elder who had only recently learned to start their own campfire. Laughter was heard, tears were shed, and stories were shared. After ceremonies like the one I mentioned, we further our groundedness with the land by hosting a short field trip to either a recently burned location, a historical site where fire had existed, or a culturally relevant place. The individual that we collaborate with to host the event usually decides and leads this field trip. They describe the history of the space, their current engagement with the space, and their hopes and dreams for future engagement on the land and the return of fire to it. We then share a meal together, often catered by a local Native American owned business. Lots of conversations and laughter can be heard during this portion of the event. We've had meals of fish, wild rice, salads, sandwiches, venison, chili, so many other amazing foods. No matter what type of meal we're having, the intentions of this portion of the event are the same: togetherness and community. We then gather back around a fire to begin our semi facilitated conversation. Part of the intention of these sessions is to hear from the community what they want us as researchers, practitioners, and knowledge holders to do. They tell us how we can further the culture of fire within their and other communities. My mother, Nisogabokwe Melanie Montano, leads this conversation with her calm and inviting demeanor. She has the surprising ability to pull stories out of people that were held deep within inside of them, stories that haven't seen the light in years, sometimes decades. She asks questions such as, how has fire historically impacted your community, and how might fire restoration build community? Or describe your relationship to fire, different types of fire, and how it makes you feel. We have the honor to hear so many answers from various generations and diverse identities of people. Um, at the core, individuals discuss how fire is a being and has a spirit and must be respected as such. They talk about how fire has so many roles in our communities, including within the ceremonies. Community members often share their memories of picking blueberries and about how abundant they used to be. They share stories from their grandparents of how they used to set fire to the land. They talk about how some forests today feel clogged and overgrown due to the lack of fire. Many youth in attendance express their interest in further involvement with fire. There are concerns about the absence of fire. They recognize the risk of catastrophic, high intensity wildfires. We talk about the decrease in culturally important species, or the increase in other species, such as the increase in mosquitoes, which I'm not particularly excited about. People worry about these soils and how they're lacking nutrients due to the lack of fire. They would also like to cut through all of the red tape that is blocking the way to conducting burns on the land. Overall, the communities are asking for more education, more training, more resources to develop fire programs. They ask for help to return fire to the land. Overall, there is strong support for the return of fire within tribal communities in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. We always hear at least one person every time who says, let's just burn it. And I feel for that person, and I would like to say that as well. So these are areas where you come in. It's kind of the final slide of my presentation. I would like to ask you to further the culture of fire by supporting fire trainings within historically marginalized communities, integrating fire into educational curriculum, both at the K-12 and college levels, provide personnel support to tribes who would like to conduct burns on their lands, conduct fire history research in collaboration with tribal nations, preserving, protecting, and honoring indigenous knowledges regarding fire, let nearby tribes inform the who, what, when, where, and why of burns. Share information with community members about upcoming burns and how allow them to attend and observe in a safe manner. Engage youth in fireworks such as tree ring activities or burn monitoring, as youth are the fire practitioners and researchers of the future. So these are all things you can do to help further many cultures of fire. These are specifically the things that Indigenous communities are asking you to do as informed by these listening sessions that we've been conducting. I thank you for listening to all of my stories today. I hope that you enjoyed them and that they inspired you in some way. I hope that maybe you will continue to share my story with others and continue to share your own stories about your culture of fire with others. Miigwech Bizendawiyik. Thank you all for listening.
Well, thank you for sharing, Bazile. That was fantastic. Not only did you offer us some great knowledge, but also I always enjoy every conversation with you. You just send a lot of good energy, which I very much appreciate and relish. With that, we're going to move on to our next speaker, Mary Huffman. Mary, Bazile, if you stop sharing up, and Mary, if you can cue yourself, that would be fantastic while I go through your introduction. I am pleased for the opportunity to introduce our final speaker of the day, Mary Huffman. Mary serves as the director of the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network with the Nature Conservancy. Mary's first job in TNC in 1986 was to bring back fire to the Kitty Todd Preserve in Northwest Ohio, a place where I learned how to propagate Corner blues. Removal of Ojibwe people and their fire practices there had upset the balance of the landscape for a century earlier. She became a burn boss, planning and leading prescribed fires for the Nature Conservancy across the state. Mary subsequently moved to Florida to build a fire program on the Lake Wales Ridge. That program included 8 partner organizations in 30 different natural areas. In 2004, Mary returned to fire studies, earning her PhD in fire management with a focus on fire stewardship by Mayan farmers in the Chiapas, Mexico. Today, the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network celebrates its 10th anniversary. Congratulations. Providing a support network among Native American communities that are revitalizing their traditional fire cultures in today's context. Mary, thank you so much for being part of our workshop today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Neil. I appreciate it. And it's an honor to follow Bazile, who introduces us to at least one Indigenous fire culture. I'm really going to focus our time on what it means to be, or to try to be, an ally in supporting more than one fire culture. Let's see, how does that screen look, Neil? Does that look, say, a learner's guide to Indigenous cultural burning?
I am not seeing your screen shared yet, Mary.
Uh-oh. All right, hold on. Let's see what happens here.
It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without it.
Yeah,
So,
right.
We're good. It'll happen. I have faith.
There we go. Let's see here, share. Now, how we doing?
I think it's queuing up. There we go. It's a little bit of a delay. We're in presenter view currently.
Okay. Present, okay. So what I need to do is do it in a slideshow view.
There you go. Thanks, Mary.
Come on now. Here we are. I'm tucked away in a little cabin in the mountains. There we go. So what does it mean to really try to support more than one fire culture? And if you are a non-Indigenous person to this continent, what does that feel like? What does that look like? What are some of the main lessons? And I'm aware that in the fire community, at least today in the mainstream world of fire, Native peoples are far underrepresented, and also that there are a lot of us who want to be accomplices or allies in supporting Indigenous cultural burning, but how do we go about that? And honestly, a lot of the people that I listen to who are not Indigenous are a little bit afraid. We're a little reticent. We're afraid we're going to say the wrong thing. We're afraid we're going to offend someone. And so this learning journey, I'll just share some of the lessons that have come to me through some generous teaching of various tribes across the United States and around the world. My acknowledgement is really thank you to the many Indigenous fire practitioners who have cared for land, plants, and animals with fire since time immemorial. So why do Indigenous peoples use fire? And of course, this is a very broad list of many fire cultures, but they tend to be things that many tribes have in common. I'll just use the term tribes for short. We could say First Nations, we could say Indigenous peoples, but for brevity, I will probably use the word tribes a fair amount. Lots and lots of reasons. Why wouldn't you use fire for your medicinal plants to benefit your berries? Some of the things that Bazile talked about, but also you want to see who's coming to your village. You may want to actually cool the rivers and creeks with smoke for the salmon. You may just have a sacred obligation to give back to the land through this relationship with fire. Those of us who are from some kind of settler ancestry can be pretty sure that our ancestors didn't really realize that the lands that they arrived on were so abundant, with such wonderful visibility, such rich wildlife, such rich plant life, because Native people had been tending them with fire for so long. We just, and in the whole lessons of manifest destiny that we used to learn in school, at least I did, in the Midwest, was that, you know, there was this sort of God-given landscape where settlers were supposed to come and be prosperous. But the truth is, there were already many peoples there. They had been decimated by disease, by violence, etc., genocide. But the land that was there was because they had cared for it. So when we think about our own fire system, I call the white fire system the dominant fire system. It seems to be the prevailing system in our world today, but it was designed for firefighting. It was designed for fire prevention, and there's nothing about it that was really designed to support Indigenous cultures. So if we are just supporting the dominant system, we have to remember that entails cultural erasure for other fire cultures. Oopsie, my switcher's not working now. Come on now. Well, maybe I have to do it this way. Bazile showed a close-up of this notice that was posted on in the forest, I think in the Midwest probably, but early on, if you were on the East Coast, fire was criminalized in the 1600s, elsewhere a little bit later. But if you are even up in Northern California, you can still listen to Indigenous peoples today who will say, oh yes, I have relatives who were shot at, and many today imprisoned, fined. I've been in a place in Yurok territory, for example, where a gentleman was just cleaning up around his homestead, not in the colonial sense, but his home area, and was issued a citation. And there's nothing about indigenous fire practice that really relates to arson. It's just a whole different thing. But our system treats it that way. And so it is an acknowledgement that we need to make. And I thank Bazile for his request that we do what we can to support many fire cultures. There are some really, really important differences between the dominant fire system that we see today and how it operates compared to indigenous systems. And we meaning white society, really put together the dominant system to be mobile and transferable. It was designed to be a system where firefighters who were trained in a certain way could show up in a place when they were dispatched and work together efficiently to put fire out. It was mobile. Those of you that have been involved in firefighting have seen it. You've been on fires where there are people from all over the country, coast to coast, north to south, and they know how to work together because they're trained in this sort of what I call sort of a pop-up and mobile system. There's nothing wrong with that system. It's just a different system from indigenous fire systems, which are fundamentally place-based. I consider these fire cultures forever fire cultures that have evolved with people in forever places. And they operate on this accumulation of really nuanced, deep knowledge of a particular environment. So these practices are really sophisticated. And there's some studies, comparative studies of indigenous fire systems around the world. And I'm thinking of one in particular published 2013. I happen to be the author, but the point is I compared a bunch of literature, and on average, I think indigenous peoples are thinking about 60 different factors when they are putting fire on the ground. So nothing about our system is more sophisticated than theirs. In fact, perhaps the opposite. So here we are in contemporary times. And of course, if you are trying to get into prescribed burning, you're trying to get into firefighting, what's the first thing people tell you? They tell you have to take a course. Well, if you were like a dear colleague named Elizabeth Azus, who's Yurok, she was trained by her grandfather to have the proper relationship with fire when she was 4. Dr. Bill Tripp from the Karuk tribe will tell you how he learned from his great-grandmother when he was also 4, and that he was burning on his own by the time he was 6. So these peoples who have really shared and transferred knowledge from generation to generation and continue to make it a intergenerational practice, us suggesting that they adopt the dominant fire culture can be a little insulting. But don't fear. Supporting indigenous cultural burning doesn't mean that it's a knock on the dominant system. It's not. I certainly want the firefighting forces to come to my neighborhood when it's on fire, and that's happened a few times over the last several years. I live in a dry place in Colorado, and in our current ways that we live and have our homes and whatnot, we depend on them. But just be aware that indigenous cultural burning is these are forever people using a forever system that was given to them by their creator to care for the land and care for their people. So both need a place to exist. If you pay attention to only one, the dominant system, then really the result is cultural erasure. I love this comparison of photographs. Smokey is, of course, interacting with these little boys in a friendly way. On the right side is a young Yurok boy in a traditional basket that is made of plant materials that are need to be burned in order to be suitable for weaving. So Bazile did mention fire has spirit. Some people in the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network that I'm associated with say fire is a spirit. It's a relative, it has agency. These systems were carefully governed. I think when settlers really started to colonize, they didn't realize how sophisticated all of these indigenous systems are. And these roles and responsibilities can be very different. They can be gender specific, they can be inherited. Sometimes they can be earned or assigned. But some of these roles really require a lifetime of training. And so these practices are not taken lightly by local people, but certainly are very far from some odd notion. And again, I reflect on my own education as a white person in suburban Ohio, which was, oh yeah, these sort of, native people were just sort of wandering around and, they hunted and fished and gathered, but never any inkling of how sophisticated these systems really are. Think about your own education. I wonder if you have some shared experience there with me. Remember that the educational system of many indigenous cultures is passed from generation to generation. It's not about books. It's not about classes. It's about being with your relatives, with your communities, training and practice, learning by doing in a place in the ways that have been honed over generations. As a white person, I came to fire. My first fire class was through a university. But these systems are very different. It's also true, and you will hear if you listen to people from various tribes, you'll hear people say, if we take care of the land will take care of us. Everything is tied to everything and can't be separated. And so we experience this sort of clash of cultures. If you, for example, came to fire through school and college, you likely are in some kind of an applied science program. Well, science programs are generally hypothesis-based. They are designed to sort of separate out all the confounding factors so that you can really determine cause and effect. That is just far, far different from indigenous ways of knowing in which everything is tied to everything. Oh, my graphic is a little funny there. Interesting. I think it's important to take a look at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's not hard to read. It's available online. The document is made of various articles, which are essentially statements of Indigenous peoples' rights. And one of the really important ones to remember if you are thinking about partnering with Indigenous communities in fire is that they have the right to self-determination. They have the right to shape their future, and that includes their future with fire. And so it puts us non-Indigenous people in a position of followership, I would say, listening and followership, because we don't know what their path is to revitalizing their traditional fire cultures, and they have the essential right to do that. And it causes us to work in different ways. I often ask people, how many times have you been rewarded for your followership? White people are always taught about leadership, but it just is not appropriate necessarily in this case. There's also some legal background in the United States that was really established early on and has been upheld for a long time, but it says the rights of a tribe that were not specifically extinguished by treaty or by an act of Congress are still retained by the tribe. Now, there aren't a whole lot of tribes that want to test that with fire sovereignty, but this is the prevailing opinion of the courts in this country, the Supreme Court. And so, in essence, if a tribe did not give up the right to use fire, it still has that right. So if that's the case, then asking tribal people for burn permits is kind of an odd notion, but that's the way we treat people. Somehow the colonists, and through our own history of colonization, have decided that the government pretty much owns fire, meaning the federal government, state governments, county governments, etc. But asking an indigenous person to get a permit with fire is really a knock on their sovereignty. Another one of the United Nations Declaration rights of indigenous peoples is the right to protect their intellectual property. And I know it was particularly emphasized in the Biden administration and prior administrations that the federal agencies, the fire agencies, should be taking into account indigenous knowledge. But with that comes a responsibility to protect that knowledge. And so again, we have a clash of cultures where in our federal governments, we say, well, public information is public. And if we work particularly with federal funds or through federal policy with tribes, that information then becomes public. You really have to watch that, because if that information seems shareable to you, it may not be from the perspective of the tribe. And so it puts you into a responsibility to make sure you're asking permission, or you're going to great lengths to figure out who's going to own, for instance, your monitoring data. I am convinced that tribal people are the busiest people in the world. If someone like Bazile is taking time to interact in the white world, you can be pretty sure that he's also got double responsibility and maybe triple responsibility to uphold his own culture. And that's a full-time job. So don't worry if Native people don't answer your emails or your phone calls. They know what's important to them, and they will get to you in time when they feel like your priority somehow supports theirs. You also have to remember that working with us non-Indigenous people involves what Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen would say is emotional labor. You and I as non-Indigenous people may want to familiarize ourselves with the history of what's happening in Bazile's neighborhood and how that is expressed in today's efforts to revitalize fire. But remember, when you're going through that, you're asking them to relive that trauma that has the trauma of genocide, all of the things that befall oppressed communities. So be aware of what you're asking. I think I covered that. Oh, co-creating projects. So it's so I would say so common and so arrogant for those of us, and I can speak for myself, thinking about partnering with a tribe, you think, oh, I know what we should do. No, you don't know what we should do. You have to get in community, you have to get in conversation with the tribe you're trying to work with and ask, what's your journey? How do you want to get there? How do you see working together? And before you say, oh, I have a brainy idea, you have to co-create that from the very, very beginning. It will also be common when, again, you as a non-Indigenous person approach a tribe and say, is there some way we can support each other? Is there some way we can work together to put more good fire on the ground? Sometimes tribes will say, well, our fire was regulated out of our hands generations ago, and we've lost a lot of our fire culture. And I would just encourage you to accept that, to hear what people are saying, but also make space for memories that will return. And when Native people, as Bazile mentioned, when Native people are together in a safe space, in a space where their systems are respected, sometimes the stories will start to come back. Oh, my auntie used to tell me about that place on the hill where we used to collect berries. My grandfather told me that they used to burn over there. And so they will bring back pieces of their knowledge for their own use, and the extent to which you can make safe space for that really does bring a lot of joy. The other piece I try to keep in mind is I try not to get into other people's sacred space. That's their sacred stuff. You don't need to know that. But if they say, we're really looking to burn this fall, you can just say, how can I be useful in making that happen? I don't have to say why. I don't have to say, oh, that's so interesting. It's just, how can I help you make that happen? Or is there a role for people from the dominant fire system to be of use in making that happen? And it's possible they might say, no, thank you, white people have helped quite enough. They might say, what you could really do is keep other people out of our way. But I think there is a role for people who are familiar with the dominant system to be of use in helping others navigate that system when they are, in fact, trying to revitalize a different fire culture. Because otherwise you're punished, right? You get fined or imprisoned. There's a wonderful quote that was shared by Margot Robbins, who's a co-founder of the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network. It's not her quote. She learned it from a woman who learned it from her uncle. But the saying goes, putting our fire culture back together is like picking up pieces of a broken mirror. As we reassemble them, we can see ourselves. Trust, of course, is a big factor. And Dr. Bill Tripp is a dear colleague. And we had been working together for probably 3 years, I think, in the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership. And one day he said to me, you know, Mary, I never tell anyone anything important until I've known them for at least 5 years. and I just looked at him and said, Bill, are we getting close? It is so true that many cultures among tribes in the United States are dependent on fire. They're fire dependent cultures. And Marta would say, without fire, our culture will not survive. It's that simple. I will stop there and turn the mic back over to Neil and others. So thank you for your time. I appreciate the opportunity to be together with you.
Back, everyone. Give people a minute to gather. And while they do, I want to just give a quick shout out to the Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge in Southern Illinois, who is hosting a watch party. So if there are other watch parties out there participating in our workshop, we would be happy to hear about that in the chat. So if you want to give us your location and how many folks are joining you, we would love to see that. But with that, we're going to move on to what we're calling our fireside chat. And I invite Steve, Mary, and Bazile. Good, you guys are all sharing your cameras. A huge thanks to all three of you for sharing your outstanding gifts of information and knowledge with our growing fire community here in the Northeast and Midwest. You all offered us a lot to think about. And in the tradition of gifts, I certainly hope that we can find ways of reciprocating the gifts that you've given us. And I hope that we can all do a little bit of that by gifting you with thoughtful questions. To get our fireside chat started, which for the audiences, for our participants, it's really just a conversation amongst our panelists for now. We aren't going to open the floor just yet, but I did have a couple of seed questions that I shared with our panelists earlier. And I'm going to start with those, and you guys can take this conversation wherever you want to take it. I'm really hoping that the three of you will just, have a fireside chat. So the first question was really more of a compare and contrast. You all have your respective experiences with fire cultures are unique, clearly, with some obvious overlap. So I'm curious to kick things off if you would discuss any noteworthy similarities or differences among the past or present fire cultures that you've been involved with, live in, and study. I don't know who wants to start, but
yeah, the more I look at the history of fire in different parts of the world and in different societies, the big transition is what I'll use the clumsy term modernity. It's this package, essentially Enlightenment science, the technology that co-evolves with it, the kind of commerce economy that emerged with that, eventually globalized, and Europe's expansion, that sort of second wave expansion, became the vector for that. And that is what really is the divide for me. Before that, we have different peoples. One traditional fire culture may be replaced by another. But they're all within living landscapes. They're all within, they have to operate within certain constraints. And this new wave is what really shatters that. And I'm struck by how long traditional fire culture sustained itself in much of Europe until they joined, Portugal joins the EU. It suddenly is exposed to a modern economy. Suddenly, the old land and the old ways of doing it are no longer attractive, and the fire culture is lost. So I think that for me, not discounting all the other stuff that goes on with it, that for me is the divide, and that's the common challenge. This is look, you've got a retired academic. I'm a recovering academic. So what academics do is abstract, and that's what I'm doing here is trying to find some larger themes that we all share on this.
So, Steve, something that comes to mind for me is a paper that was written by a man named Francisco Seijo, who's Spanish, and he was saying that some of the burning that was happening in Spain was really political resistance by the pastoralists who were still kind of railing against the the influx of plantation forestry that happened under the Franco administration. And I wonder if that's still going on, or if the depopulation of some of those areas is really what's holding sway and driving the fire dynamics there now.
Well, yeah, and that the same thing happens in Portugal, and it happens in Greece. It's a common thing. It's basically the entry into the modern world, the developed world. And part of that is, frankly, fossil fuels as an alternative and fossil biomass as an alternative for all the things fire did. Now you can get the old dream of some European intellectuals to ban open burning and smoke is possible. Well, the consequences are worse than anything before. But but yeah, there is a lot of protest. There's a protest movement, as there was in the American West, even among settlers in California, and as happened in the Southeast, as happened in Appalachia, all over. It is not until sort of the full weight of that transition occurs and people leave the land.
Mm.
They leave and somebody else replaces, or they leave. And that's where you get the transition. And at that point, the oral culture is lost. The traditional culture is lost because they're disconnected from the land, and they've lost that heritage.
Yeah. Well, and so, Bazile, when I think about my own relationship with fire and I compare it to when I listen to Native communities, the contrast is so striking to me, because I feel like Native people have this forever relationship with where they feel their creator put them and how their creator gave them responsibility for an ongoing relationship with fire. So in some ways, I feel like Indigenous people are the hope for a proactive relationship with fire rather than a reactive one. How do you feel?
Yeah, I think that's a good framing. I think, as has been mentioned and shown throughout these presentations this morning, we all have a cultural fire. We all have this shared uh, we all value fire. We have this like genetic memory. I think of people sitting around a campfire, and there's such this moment where we're all just staring at it, and it's like this feeling that has connected us since humans existed. But what I think is different about indigenous fire is that somehow through colonization, assimilation, and the attempted removal of cultural practices, is somehow we've been able to grip onto what we've known since the beginning of time. We've been able to hold on to this knowledge and actively use it today. And I think that's where we find a lot of hope in indigenous peoples and how we can learn a lot from them. We like the Karuk folks have been doing the same traditions, still evolving, but same traditions since time immemorial. And there's been a lot of changes within Western fire practices and the ways that they view fire, but indigenous peoples, it has remained relatively the same.
That was something that jumped out to me from the culmination of your 3 presentations. The differences between traditional cultures of fire that worked with natural systems versus what evolved to become, Steve, you described as forcing in Europe, forcing fire, and that it was no longer, you were no longer working fire within natural systems, but you were forcing it in places where it was potentially perceived to be useful, but not necessarily congruent with the natural systems where those folks lived. Did I misinterpret that?
No, I think, and in fact, that's part of the problem. Part of it is Western science. Western science lost fire. Fire was something that went into machine. It was combustion or energy.
Mm-hmm.
Fire in its natural habitat no longer existed. It just
Literally put it in a
disappears
box.
as an academic subject. I mean, earth, air, and water all have departments and disciplines devoted to their study at universities.
Mm-hmm.
Fire, the only fire department's one that sends an emergency vehicle. It disappeared. So we didn't have a fire science, even though foresters and others claimed we did. And the science that developed, Enlightenment science, is based on universal principles. And I think this is an insight that Mary gave as well. So it is transportable everywhere. We begin on first universal principles and we derive everything from that. And that applies everywhere. So we can move crews everywhere because they are engaged in the same. That is not true. That has failed repeatedly. And this is something I think we can learn from. Indigenous peoples have a kind of political standing that allows their voice to be heard. This may sound paradoxical in ways that traditional whites are not. But even in Europe, they're talking, the only way out of this is not more firefighting, more science, more rest of it. We have to recover part of that old landscape in a more modern form, but recover that and recover those traditions. That is the only way out. So they are deeply committed now to trying to recover that knowledge. And unfortunately, so much of it is gone or going because it's oral. And we kind of had an interesting demonstration with the 3 presentations. I don't know if whoever designed this, I think intuitively or understood that. So I'm giving, out of the European culture, what am I doing? I'm using written material, I'm using paintings, I'm using historic archived photos, all of which, by the way, suits presentation by Zoom, PowerPoint and present very nicely.
Story.
Bazile is talking about an oral culture, where the personality, the person speaking, is important to be in contact with the group. He has to tell stories. That is not a medium that works well on PowerPoint. So he is already disadvantaged, right?
Mm.
That and Mary doing now what she did with her dissertation is trying to broker between the two and find ways to make it work. And ultimately, I've decided I don't care. I'm not converting people to a particular worldview. What matters is what happens on the ground. And we can have 20 people, everyone seeing this fire differently. But as long as the fire gets done is what matters. Everybody's entitled to their own understanding of that. I don't care.
Good point.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I also am aware as kind of a, I guess, in the United States, and a person who learned more or less as an adult, to be in relationship with fire, that my knowledge is always going to be superficial compared to an indigenous person who learned from their great grandmother. I mean, I've spent a lifetime, thinking about fire and watching fire, being part of fire and all of that. But I don't have any traditional stories that tie fire to cosmology. I don't have stories that tie to, other than fire ecology science, how fire interacts with plant and animal relatives. We, those of us in sciences think about, the whole point is people are separate from nature, right? And you study it as an object, but you're not in relationship with it. And good God, if you were, your science would be, totally
Yeah,
called.
somehow that feels wrong. Yeah, from the way we're taught. Yep.
Yeah. Well, science has been great for making tools and devices and things. It has not shown how to live on the land with fire, which is the ultimate challenge.
Mhm.
And that has got to
Yeah.
come from some other aspects of the culture.
Yeah, I think the foundations of living with the land and with the beings within it has a foundation in just reciprocal relationships. The whole idea is to be reciprocal with the land around us, and the whole notion of taking care of those that take care of us. Like obviously, we if somebody's going to take care of you, you're going to want to take care of them. You're going to want to be reciprocal. You're going to want to in their times of need, be there for them. Another foundation of not just living in reciprocity with the land, but also considering the land as not only living and a being and having spirit and should be respected as such, but also as your relative. Like literally somebody that is related to you and they have that utmost importance that you're going to take care of them as a relative. You're going to want want them to prosper, want them to succeed, and thinking of them as such as something that's lacking within Western science is thinking of things as resources to be extracted upon or objects to be studied through a microscope. There's the lack of holistic thinking. There's the lack of animacy. There's a lack of value of things as our relatives and a lack of understanding of living with the land rather than on the land.
Well, that
But we see it today. We see more of it today. Like that's not to negate all of the
Mhm.
amazing conversations that we're having right now. There's the return of that. The people in the Western world who are conducting burns are caring for the land and they want to see the land prosper. And I think that's great. We're getting to that more.
And I
There's
think
a
that's a
book.
great. I'm sorry, Steve. Go ahead.
No, I was just thinking it reminds me of a book that has had a lot of circulation over the years. James Scott's Seeing Like a State. And he takes what happens with local knowledge when outsiders, elites come in and they want to universalize it so they can understand it, make that world legible.
Ah,
Instead of filled with all the details and quirks and back alleys and everything else, you want to rationalize it so that it's understandable to them so they can be in control and do things and make things better to their mind.